Hello and welcome to week 9 of the term. So for the next 2 weeks we'll be looking at wintry kind of landscapes. So the first thing that I thought we would do is just kind of look at 3 different sort of palettes of colour that we could potentially use when painting these kind of wintry landscapes. So I've chosen this little picture of a hut with sort of snowy trees in the background and sort of lovely foreground as well. So what I'm going to ask you to do initially is to trace this image, and I'd like you to draw it 3 times or reproduce it 3 times just on one sheet of paper. And once you've done that, we'll start looking at a limited palette, a cold palette and a warm palette. So this first week, I'm not asking you to do anything finished. We're just going to be sort of playing around with colour and techniques, really. But looking at these 3 different palettes is going to be the first place for us to start. So let's get started with the first painting. So the first one that we're going to do is using a limited palette, and we're just going to use 2 colours. We're going to use burnt umber, and we're going to use cobalt blue, and we're going to use those just to kind of you know, get to know how to paint a kind of snowy scene, and just kind of start experimenting and kind of using the paint, so that we can kind of then start kind of building on that, really. Okay, so I've put my paint out already, and let's get started. So I'm just going to cover up my other drawings. Let's just bring that down a bit. Okay. So some of the techniques that we're going to be sort of using this time round is really kind of wet into wet, and almost kind of knowing when to go in with paint. So it's a little bit more of a sort of technical challenge, really. So sorry, first thing I want to do is actually just, you know, wet that background. So I'm not going to, looking at my picture, what I'm not going to put in all those trees. I'm just going to kind of concentrate on this little shaping of trees. So I'm just wetting the background initially with just a mix of water. Okay, so the distant trees, I'm just going to use a sort of fairly sort of thin wash, and I'm just going to start kind of putting those in. And you can see as soon as I put that in, it starts moving around already, doesn't it? Just taking some of that off. And once I've kind of got that in, I'm going to start mixing a little bit more of a sort of warmer kind of grey by bringing in some of that burnt umber. And maybe when it's kind of closer to the house, it's kind of warmer, so I can kind of put in more brown into my mix. And really, as it kind of goes off into the distance here, I'm just going to, leave that as it is and perhaps just bring in a little bit of the brown over on this side. Really just to sort of balance what I'm doing here, so perhaps to sort of suggest that's a little bit too blue, perhaps to suggest sort of trees here. So I'm quite happy with that. Now we can sort of maybe just do something on the house. So the house, let's bring in that lovely burnt umber. So let's decide on a direction of the light, where's the light coming in from. So it seems on the picture that this side here, this face here is darker and this side here is lighter. So, with that in mind, I'm going to just make this face here a little bit cooler. So although I'm using my lovely sort of burnt umber, I'm actually adding a little bit more of the blue in on this side. So I'm just using a fairly sort of dryish kind of brush. Perhaps just to suggest some kind of snow. And although I realise this picture is kind of a landscape, I'm actually adding a little bit of interest here. So that is the limited palette. So what we're looking at is cobalt blue and our lovely burnt umber, the warmth of the burnt umber. And then what you get when you mix that are these, you know, lovely kind of warm greys. You know, and kind of beautiful kind of bluey greys as well. You know, so perhaps that's once that's dried, I can kind of darken those trees a little bit. But really, I'm sort of quite happy with it as it is. So the second one that we're going to do is to look at more of a kind of colder palette. So for this, I'm going to bring in a little bit of phthalo blue. And you can see, you know, when I'm kind of putting it down, it's actually a very, very cool blue compared to the cobalt, which is just here on my palette already, on my paper already. So with that, I'm going to bring in a little bit of alizarin crimson. I'm still going to keep my my cobalt, my burnt umber, and I am going to keep my cobalt as well. So let's bring that back again, and I'm also going to add in a little bit of raw sienna just to add just a kind of touch of warmth, really. So once again, I'm going to just wet that kind of background. Oh, and by the way, I did go back in once I was a little bit drier and add a little bit more darkness just around, you know, the house, really. Okay, so now this whole kind of wet into wet technique that I'm using with this in the background, where it's kind of suggesting these really sort of beautiful trees in the distance. Now, I really would like you to practice this. So I'm just going to concentrate a little bit more on that with this demo, even though obviously we're also changing colours as well. So I've wet the background here, and I'm just going to let that kind of sink in a little bit before I start perhaps adding in, let's start with the cobalt again, and then we'll bring in some of the phthalo blue. So recap, I'm putting down the colour just like I did last time, and I'm just allowing it to move within that kind of wet area. So using my brush, dot, 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 up to suggest perhaps, you know, the shape of those trees. It's a little bit dark there. Lift out a little bit. So carrying on with that same kind of approach, dot, 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 dot. Now you can see it's a little bit dry there. That's fine. I'm not going to do anything about that right now. In fact, sometimes I think it just adds you know, a little bit of kind of interest when it's not completely wet. Yep, perhaps there's some sort of taller trees here, and then we've got this one which is sort of quite close to us here on the right hand side. Okay, so without doing too much, that already looks like sort of lovely sort of trees in the distance. So I'm going to leave that alone for a little while. Perhaps just start mixing a kind of very, you know, a sort of dark green colour for this. So the phthalo blue with the raw sienna is going to give me my green. Okay, but at the moment, as you can see, and you'll see that when you mix it up, it ends up looking something like Viridian, which is not what we want, because we want it to look sort of dark. So we add the complementary colour, which is alizarin crimson or a red or something like that, preferably alizarin, to get this lovely sort of dark green. Okay, so we can then start kind of dropping that colour in. So notice I'm kind of leaving gaps, dot, 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 around the house. And let's just take it all the way up. Okay, just going to go to a little bit more kind of blue as I'm going up. Just soften that all down as it goes up. And as it comes away over here, you can see it gets lighter. So for that, I'll go back to my lovely cobalt, and again just suggest at those kind of trees, you know, kind of going off into the distance there. Okay, and then as it comes forward again, going to add a little bit of my burnt umber to that mix. You know, just to kind of suggest at that kind of you know, tree that might be here. Okay, so that can then lead us nicely to the house. So now we've got this alizarin crimson to play with, so we can bring that into the house. So perhaps we can start playing with that colour now. So what we've got with this one is a lovely sort of cool palette, but with touches of sort of warmth with the raw sienna just kind of popping through, just to give it a little bit of a balance. So you can see from the two how, you know, how different palettes can kind of give a very, very different feel. Right, so let's do the warm palette next. So the first thing to do with the warm palette is, I feel, is actually what I'm going to do is give it a wash with the raw sienna all over, and I'm going to let that dry. So you can do that in two ways. You can either wet the whole thing and then drop the colour in, but because it's such a small area, I'm actually just going to you know, just do it in one go. And as it sort of comes forward, I'm going to leave some kind of lighter areas in there as well. Okay, so just take a little bit off there, maybe a little bit off there. So I'm hoping you can kind of see that. So, you know, remembering this kind of direction, I've kind of just used a thirsty brush and just kind of lifted little bits off. I'm also going to add a little bit of sort of pinky colours here and there as well. Yeah, let's just see what happens with that. Once I've done that, obviously, I'm going to let it dry. So I'm going to leave that maybe for about half an hour, 45 minutes, and just let that dry off. So we've still got the same colours. So I've used, so far, I've used my raw sienna, and I've used the alizarin crimson. And I think with that, I will also add the lovely warm brown of burnt sienna, because I think it'll be really lovely to add the warmth in. Okay, and I will stick with the cobalt blue, so I won't be using the phthalo blue in this demo at all, but I'll stick with the cobalt. So let's put that down, cobalt blue. And I will probably bring in a little bit of umber as well. Okay, so let's wait for this to dry, and we'll come back and finish that one off. Okay, so that's now nice and dry, and we can go ahead and paint a nice kind of warm sort of glow. So the reason why I've put that kind of yellow underneath is to just give it that lovely sort of warm glow already, and then anything that we do on top of that is really going to you know, just really sort of continue to be a bonus in terms of bringing warmth into the picture. So as we have done with the others, I'm going to start with adding some water into the background so that I can put those kind of trees in. So painting carefully around. What I'd like to do really is to sort of take those trees darker again. So what I'm going to do is actually just dry everything off. Oops. And then I'll just come back in, I think, and and just kind of take those a little bit darker. Okay, so let's take those trees in the background a little bit darker. So I'm going to use my cobalt and my sienna. Actually, maybe what I'll do first is I'll wet that whole area. So there we go. I've done 3 different palettes. I've done a limited palette just using the cobalt and the burnt umber. We've done a cold palette. So introducing that phthalo blue makes a huge difference with taking everything a lot sort of cooler. You've got this lovely sort of cold greeny blue happening, and then when you mix that in with the other colours, it also really sort of cools it down. And we've done a warm palette, really starting off by putting down that lovely sort of raw sienna in the background, and then painting as normal in a sense. So what I'm doing is kind of staining the paper, and it just gives this lovely sort of warm glow, you know, to the whole painting. What I'd like you to do this week is just have a go at doing these, and then next week, you know, you've got a really good idea with how to kind of paint the snow, and also kind of an experimentation with the colours as well. Okay.